RomanAlcala. Thanks for having me, Annie, and presenting something to me that makes my job a little bit easier. I actually have been working on a paper that is specifically about advocating basically an anarchist lens for critical agrarian studies more broadly, and originally planned on presenting sort of a paper, and then I was putting together notes and realized that it just seemed very boring, and that I would rather present sort of I guess you could say more from my activist angle or hat rather than sort of dispassionate analysis of why researchers really need to look at anarchism. Because really what I'm more interested in is anarchism as a practice. It's something that's been part of my life for most of my life, and so it's not something sort of abstract and reducible to these concepts. So I don't really have a very, very solid presentation figured out. Hopefully it's cohesive enough to make some sense. And I guess I wanted to start with, being at a World-Ecology conference. I think World-Ecology is pretty obviously very rooted in or based in a lot of eco-Marxist sort of terminologies and concepts and understandings of the world. And I think it's worth noting that if you haven't studied anarchism and Marxism together, people don't often recognize that those things are, basically came up together, were mutually influenced, and definitely in terms of, they share a lot of things. And one of those things is obviously anti-capitalism, and I don't think any anarchist I know would argue that anarchists have developed a critique of capitalism that is as useful or generative as Marx himself. And so that's shared. There's also, an aspect of being anti-organized religion, but the thing that really ties them together is that they both came up and became existing in the process of people trying to make social change, and particularly revolutionary social change. So both anarchism as a sort of set of principles, ideologies, whatever you want to say, Marxism as the same, and the fact that both of those were enacted by people in different places, those are all oriented towards these questions of revolutionary social change, which it seems like we're probably all here because we're interested in those things. And it's in this third section of what they sort of share that also the kind of differences between them become more apparent, and it's sort of been alluded to already in some ways, but definitely the question of the state and how you deal with the state as a social movement is one of these sort of most obvious differences. In anarchism, I think mainly you can see it coming back to the fact that anarchism has always placed a strong premium on the sort of the means and ends being similar, if not the same, and that the idea that we can't use tactics to achieve some sort of social transformation that doesn't actually correspond to the kind of world we want to live in. And of course that is pretty much in itself utopian. That's the idea, is that the utopia is always here and we must live it now. It's the whole idea of prefigurative politics. But it also involves a lot of other aspects, that organizing human social relations in non-coercive ways that can be extended to non-human relations. And definitely if you look at a lot of indigenous traditions, which have a lot of affinity, not 100% of course, indigenous people are different all around the world, but that there are a lot of affinities with this sort of ultimate non-hierarchical approach to existence and to collaborating and seeing all things as relations. There's other things that come with that as well, as this real focus on directly democratic forms of organizing. So the idea of self-organization is really rooted in anarchism in a way that, although Marxism also is based on workers' movements, and there's been a lot of efforts to have democratic processes in Marxist movements as well, it's not such a premium placed on that. And there are, in fact, obviously now generations of theorists and activists, if you want to call them that, who are pretty dead set on this idea that the working classes can't be trusted to basically lead themselves into a social revolution and must be led by vanguards of various sorts. Shifting, I guess I want to shift a little bit to this food sovereignty realm, the thing that we're here to theoretically talk about. Luckily, Annie presented a little bit about Via Campesina. It seems like people are mostly relatively well versed, but it's obvious if you look at Via Campesina, it's this diverse network. It has a lot of different constituent members. Those members do not all treat the state in the same way at the national, regional, subnational levels. And therefore at the international level as a network composed of those groups, it's not that Via Campesina could at all be argued to have an anarchist politics. It clearly does not reject the state out of hand. In fact, Via Campesina and a lot of its members engage quite regularly with international intergovernmental institutions, mostly at the FAO. But so there's definitely not a sort of categorical rejection of the state going on within food sovereignty movements, but they're still pretty ambivalent. There's definitely a bottom line sort of analysis that says that states have been consistently implicated in undermining food sovereignty, right, and in being a part of the agribusiness advance of capital, right? So there's definitely a line from via Campesina and other food sovereigntists that implicate the state very directly in the harms that they've experienced. And this is not surprising, again, if you think about this history of both state capitalist and state communist pushes to basically expropriate the peasantry and sort of take away their ability to live more quote-unquote traditional lifestyles. And I think that this ambivalence is sort of obvious in a way if you think about the fact that I think Annie also alluded to this, that there is no straightforward, obvious strategic imperative to have to address and deal with and can take command of the state, or to completely be outside of it and try to gain some sort of purist autonomy outside of it. Neither of those really speak to every condition of every movement in every place that is looking for something like food sovereignty. This balance between what local community autonomy looks like in relationship to a national level of autonomy in relation to the global system. These are things that food sovereignty movements have had to deal with place by place, and as such, they haven't had a party line. And I think that makes sense and is something that we should think about in terms of if we're going to continuously use Marxist and anarchist or other sorts of terminologies that are about ists, about creating a sort of one-party line strategy. I think we're probably going to end up losing a lot of our momentum as movements. And so I'm definitely not here to try to sort of straightforwardly advocate that, you know, food sovereignty should be anarchist per se, but rather instead that we should just see the fact that anarchism, even though yes, the Latin Americanist side of La Via Campesina is very strong and the Latin Americanist tradition is very steeped in a pretty heavy Marxism, there's also a lot of autonomist kinds of ideas embedded within food sovereignty and food sovereignty movements. So some of those we can think about the fact that there is this emphasis on community autonomy. I brought this book because it's called Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement by Monica White. I really recommend it. It's a great academic book that doesn't read like an academic book. And she talks a lot about collective agency and community resilience as her theoretical frameworks when looking at black radical traditions of agricultural-based liberation here in the US. So there's resonance between some of the stuff that people talk about in this sort of international sphere about the peasantry, but it's also something that's not foreign to even our own country and its lineages of struggle. Similarly, a lot of the stuff that Monica talks about in here related to this idea of community level autonomy, so that's both decision making, it's also a material thing about actually producing for oneself. It's not about this, you know, sort of white escapist notion of individual self-sufficiency. It's about community resilience and community autonomy, and it involves, of course, this element of internal democracy, this idea that there's non-hierarchical relations being engendered within these communities themselves, and that these processes build like an affinity for solidarity, that people become aware of the power of solidarity, they want to live in solidarity-based ways, exhibit mutual aid. These are definitely all anarchist ideas that have long been promoted, but they're often just lived by people because they make sense without having any sort of particular connection to an anarchist particular sort of ideology. This also relates to what Maiwa mentioned, the moral economy. This concept of moral economy has its own sort of intellectual lineage, but it's also very self-explanatory for a lot of people who live them, which is essentially, you know, just because capitalism exists doesn't mean that our actual social relations are based on capitalist social relations. And I think David Graeber basically said this the best, that, you know, that there would be no capitalism without communism. Everyday communism, the ways that we relate and actually sustain our lives together in ways that are not capitalist in logics, is what enables capitalism to exist in the first place. So alongside these sort of ideal utopian sorts of ways of thinking, there's also an acknowledgement, which people don't often admit about anarchist theory, that no one is expecting there to be some perfect anarchist utopia, and that there's not this ruptural point where all of a sudden the systems come down and now everyone's getting along and acting on all these principles. There's an idea that it's always a continuous project, and that there is never a point of perfection. I think it's very much admitted by the key 19th century philosopher theorists, as well as a lot of people talk about it today. And as it mentioned in this book, Monica talks about the fact that economic autonomy, which a lot of the Black radical tradition was about, is in fact an ideal and always a matter of degree, and that it's a process, a continuum that moves from complete dependence on an oppressive structure to independence. It's always partial and difficult to accomplish. The point is that no one is saying in these anarchist-inspired spaces or anarchist spaces that that this way is in itself going to accomplish everything we wanted to do, and that it's always kind of we make the road by walking it sort of situation. And part of the way I've seen that in Via Campesina is you look at Via Campesina and basically their initial whatever secretariat or whatever you want to call the sort of directive body was all men, and the women within Via Campesina actually had a sort of internal revolt and internal critique saying that how are we going to have a movement of peasants without actually acknowledging that this is a feminist issue. And now feminism is a very strong element of Via Campesina, so this internal critique is also something I think really important. So the point is, yeah, the state is always going to be contradictory. It's not going to be straightforward, but there's a lot of things about what I would distinguish in this paper. I'm developing the idea of the theories of anarchism. You can kind of separate into this negative theory, which is about kind of the conditions of society, and essentially for Marx's economic reductionism, some people might say anarchism has a sort of power reductionism. It's all about relations of power, coercion, hierarchy, which can also be between humans and non-humans, right? So it's a very applicable concept. It might be a little bit too reductionist if you forget that there are differences in the ways that these hierarchies happen. But what I find is that basically in my work here in the States, working with different social movements, working on food justice and food sovereignty issues, is that there's not as much this sort of complete tactical rejection of the state that you might associate with anarchism, but that anarchism and its ideas really do pervade in a lot of the ways that people have sort of what you might call a positive critique. The idea of what is going to supplant capitalist social relations and how we go about getting there, to me seems far more inspired by these kind of anarchistic ideas of working in the here and now. These ideas of having an alternative, we talked about the alternative to the collapse narrative. Well, I think that if you look at communities who've been excluded chronically from systems of power, that they already exist within a concept of collapse, and they're not looking for something to get entry into that collapse so much as a way of always working towards a hope that's based on something else. And I think that is the exploration of the possible is something that I think if we look towards those movements and communities of people that have been generally excluded, we'll see that there's not as much this premium placed on the state. It doesn't mean that people don't ever engage in the state. They're not purist about it, but that the focus is on building these autonomous forms of power that strengthen communities in order to address whatever conditions of power must be addressed. I guess, yeah, because they can't really ever rely on the system. So, and I think Annie mentioned this also, the idea of, I would definitely recommend for anyone interested in the state and food sovereignty, there's plenty of academic articles written about it, and Annie's introduction to that one, Annie and co-authors, I think did a really good job of sort of showing a lot of the diversity of things that are happening there. But I guess one last thing is just some of the research I've been doing is thinking about how to actually use anarchism as a lens to see agrarian politics in the US, and I think just two examples. One, Loka Ashwood has a really great book called For-Profit Democracy, where she studies rural communities in Georgia who live near this nuclear power plant. And essentially she finds a lot of these informants who are people that probably in the Bay Area would be considered conservatives or Trump people. They're actually essentially anarchist in the way they perceive how the world works. They see the state as directly responsible for basically protecting capital and supporting capital accumulation against their local communities. And they take action under a moral economy idea of hunting and fishing outside of the rules, the norms of society. They directly are lawbreakers because of this idea that they're never going to get recourse from the state. And yet most often when we talk about politics in this country, we're talking about how do we create some sort of majority to get electoral power to change the thing. We don't think about how people actually think about the state in the first place, and how are we creating alignments that might not seem like they make sense, but actually make a lot of sense if you think about the histories of people and what ideologies they have. And just the one other example is I just want to give a shout out. There's an organization called Redneck Revolt, So if you haven't heard about Redneck Revolt, they are a libertarian socialist organization that is actively recruiting in communities that would otherwise go to far-right and white supremacist kinds of formations with a strongly anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, all of this stuff they're doing in these communities, in rural communities. And they're doing it because they believe that it's actually possible to create alignment based on a sort of more fundamental politics rather than these surface level politics which we tend to get to when we go into the electoral arena. So that's all.